Hi, everyone. As Jenny said, I'm Marissa Kaufman, and I'm the director of the National Alliance for Safe Housing. Welcome. I am so very excited to introduce the main presenter for the webinar today, and that's Ms. LaToya Young with the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. LaToya has been working in the domestic violence and sexual assault field now for over 12 years. She provides technical assistance on the local and national level on a range of issues, but this is an area where she has particular expertise. And I just have to say, I have known LaToya since she actually entered the field. We worked together many years ago at the District Alliance for Safe Housing. And a part of the District Alliance for Safe Housing model that's so innovative is that we, as a domestic violence program, safe housing program, started to work to engage landlords as part of the work we did to make sure that survivors who were interested were able to be in their own apartments. And so LaToya has, just vast experience on this issue, and I am just so very pleased that she's presenting. We have a partnership with the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and LaToya is now their housing coordinator. So before I pass this over to LaToya, I want to give you all a little bit of information about NASH, also known as the National Alliance for Safe Housing. We launched about 3 years ago. We're a national technical assistance and training provider, and we are housed at the District Alliance for Safe Housing. So we're a project of DASH. We have two project partners, the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We're also a partner in the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. Something that I want to share, I'm going to bounce around a little bit. The Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, many of you may have already done some of our webinars or received some technical assistance from our team. We are a group of 4 national technical assistance providers, NASH, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, and also Collaborative Solutions. And we're supported through a partnership of funding and also a collaborative partnership with FIPSA, OVW, OVC, and HUD. So now back to NASH briefly. So our mission is really to create a culture where safe housing is a right shared by everyone. And we do this by improving access, increasing resources, and trying to bring innovative solutions for survivors of violence to the field. We provide support to programs, to individuals at programs, and to systems to really make sure that the barriers that survivors face are being alleviated. And this is just a sampling of some of the technical assistance that we provide. Coordinated entry, building collaborative relationships, trauma-informed practice, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, housing first, flexible funding, and housing protections, VAWA, fair housing, and other state and local protections. So we provide support there as well. So now, just really briefly, it looks like, it's not on here for some reason, but it's going to be a resource that we share with all of you at the end of the webinar, and that is the Safe Housing Partnerships website. safehousingpartnerships.com is a fantastic resource that we worked in collaboration with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence to launch about a year and a half ago. It's the first website of its kind, and it provides resources, information, accessible information at that intersection of homeless and housing and domestic and sexual violence. And really welcome you to check it out. The link, the actual URL I can see is on the bottom of the slide that I have up right now. So we welcome you to check it out. One more thing to add before I pass it over to LaToya, and that is actually 2 more things to add. One is that in the evaluation that you all will fill out at the end to let us know how we did, there's also an opportunity to request technical assistance or training. So please use that evaluation to do that. If you have questions that we're not able to get through today in our Q&A, then please go ahead and reach out to us that way. You'll also have contact information for us, and you can reach out to us that way as well. So I am going to go ahead and pass this over to LaToya. I will be in the chat box responding to some of your questions and also polling other questions that LaToya will respond to as the webinar. So with that, I am so very happy to welcome Ms. LaToya Young and enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Larissa. You're far too kind. Welcome, everyone, to the webinar today. As explained earlier, feel free to ask any questions in the chat box. And by the end of the webinar, or before closing out the webinar, we'll have a little Q&A time. And so I'll be answering those questions there. And so thank you guys for coming and joining us for this webinar. And it's likely that you have or you will or there's some interest in working with landlords. One, because engaging with landlords can be really, really difficult. And there's always success if we can really get those positive relationships going. But one thing that we really, really know is that domestic violence survivors face very unique barriers in accessing housing, particularly around affordability and safety. And so if those are different barriers to survivors accessing housing, these landlord relationships that we build are very, very critical so that we can ensure that survivors have safety and that survivors have access to affordable housing. Next, domestic violence survivors make up more than 10% of all evictions and more than 25% of housing denials because of crimes committed against them. And this is really based on a survey that was conducted by the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty a while ago with social service providers across the country. And so what we do know is that not only are survivors facing barriers of their abusers around credit, around financial and economic abuse, but they're also facing evictions and maybe even discrimination by landlords. And so we want to be aware and be proactive in our attempts to build those relationships and even partnerships with the landlords that we're working with. Next, and last but not least, there's definitely an opportunity for survivors to practice their power and control over their own lives. And exercising their voice and their choice is so huge as you look at building relationships with landlords, but it's really about building a partnership and a trust with the survivors as they embrace housing, maybe in scattered site, or even rapid rehousing, or even housing first. And many of you out there may be even considering or have rapid rehousing programs, housing first programs, independent housing models. And what we do know from that is that private market landlords are critical to this process. And so we want to look at what that looks like and what that means. Okay, so just as much as landlords are important to survivors, working with survivors can be just as beneficial to landlords as well. And so we want to also look at some of the non-financial and some of the financial incentives there are. And so plugging those things initially as you're building these relationships with landlords can prove very positive for landlords and can end up being something that you can really build a sound foundation with landlords as you're building these partnerships. One of the things that we know is that references, they really operate as a free referral for even tenants or even for their past relationships or even the transitional housing programs that you have. And so really using that as free referrals for their units. And so landlords are not having to advertise their units. We're really coming and say, hey, we have someone for this unit. And so this can also build the momentum for landlords, and they're not actually going out and soliciting for any um, people to fill their units. They're actually having programs like your programs that you're conducting to come to them and say, hey, we have people, we have good tenants, we have survivors that are interested, and so it really, really can be very beneficial. The other piece of that is that even having a master lease, which really takes the burden of a landlord getting different rents from different tenants and officially getting the mortgage or the overall rent paid by one program or provider can prove to be a really good incentive. In addition to that, the fact that there are many tenants and survivors who come through your programs, you can really have the ability to sublease some of those programs and some of those units that you're already um, renting from landlords. I know at one point in the program that we operated through Dash, some people, because of various reasons attached to substance use and needs to relocate, because we have such a strong relationship already built with the landlords, those weren't issues that we really felt that would damage our relationships. And so we had that and we used that as a motivation to build these relationships with landlords. The other piece that is really, really good is that you're offering free training and even technical assistance. Educating landlords on best practices for responding to domestic violence or even the specific dynamics of your subgroup if you're not working only with domestic violence survivors. You may be working with just the homeless population in general, sexual assault survivors, but really using this as an opportunity to educate landlords where before they may not have been receiving such education. And not only educating them, but educating their staff on their property can prove really, really useful. I think one of the important pieces of that training and technical assistance is really to provide that as early and as often as possible on the laws and protections for survivors, because that's going to prove to be really, really key as you build partnerships and also as you maintain the relationships with that landlord. On-call advocates. Landlords often feel reassured when they discover that program participants receive home-based supportive services and that there's a reliable, attentive contact to call in case any issues arise. And so having someone, even for emergencies or just having someone that they can funnel information through can prove to be really, really helpful for landlords as you're advertising your programs with the landlords. Um, as you're going out and you're talking to landlords, it's important that you can provide just what you're saying and providing and being responsive to their concerns and needs is really a good attempt to start out with that good intervention and proactive relationships that you want to build. But it's also critical that they accept that their role is not to be a social worker. And so therefore, they have you as an advocate, they have the program staff as a support, and so there's no need for them to act as a social worker, and they have you as support, and so that can be really, really helpful and provide that non-financial support that landlords often find really, really helpful. In addition to the training and the on-call advocacy that's there, just providing landlords with the recognition of being a partner to this community, to the domestic violence and sexual assault community, can be really, really helpful. For a lot of people, just having certificates or awards or a badge of honor, even to say, like, hey, I'm doing something for the greater good, can prove to be really, really good for some landlords. On the financial side, we all can expect to know that payments, money can be really, really good for landlords. So not only are we encouraging programs and providers to have early and on-time payments, but just the fact that you're able to say, hey, this is a safety net that we're going to have. This is something that we can really do to support survivors and that you will definitely have, that can prove to be really good and building partnerships with landlords. One of the other great financial things that we've done is making sure that payments go directly to a third party. And so eliminating those loopholes of even going through direct deposits or, creating all of those additional barriers, we were able to remove some of those and really be focused on building some of those relationships with private landlords who don't necessarily have the resources to have such direct deposit systems or to have an HR process. And so just being able to say, hey, we get it. You have a 4-unit building, or you're a very small-time landlord who still does other full-time employment things. We want to work with you. So being able to provide those payments directly to the third party as opposed to, creating all sorts of loopholes, that's a huge financial safeguard for landlords. In addition to that, um, some of you all may have heard of some of the new models that some programs are using both locally and nationally around landlord mitigation funds. For instance, in the district here in DC, landlords are able to have a safety net of having landlord mitigation funds in case there are damages to their unit, or even for rent arrears. And so in the event that your client, the survivor that you're working with, there are any unresolved issues that have came up or that come up as they're phasing out of their unit, again, there's this safety net of this landlord mitigation funds that landlords can have access to. So not only are you assuring that their rents are paid on time and that they have the financial safety net while they're in their unit, these landlord mitigation funds can prove really helpful as they're even exiting out or contemplating renting the unit to additional people even after your tenant moves out. Having that subsidy guarantee, which is really about, saying we are a 2-year program, we are an 18-month program, but for those 18 months, your rent is guaranteed, can be really phenomenal. Just imagine if someone was able to just guarantee that your mortgage or even that your rent will be paid, how awesome that can feel. And so for landlords, just having that guarantee and reassurance that not only is the survivor or the tenant going to be paying their portion, but that as a provider and as someone and as a representative of even that organization, that you're saying, I understand your needs, I understand that this is important to you, and then therefore we're going to make sure that this is taken care of regardless of whether or not the tenant pays. We're here to support and we understand what your needs are. Paying those housing-related arrears to remove household debts as a barrier, such as for a lot of survivors who've come through DASH's program, at one point they were hit with this huge barrier of even applying or being approved for the unit. So at that point, we had to look into maybe satisfying some old evictions or even some old debts. And so that proved to be really helpful for landlords because they say, oh, these people are really about their business. And so if you know ahead of time that that's something that you can use and that you can do, that will prove helpful. In addition, flexible funding can be used in this manner to pay those rent arrears. And so I just want to put a plug in for the flexible funding. That's a huge and fantastic model that's been promoted both nationally and even locally here in the district. And so really using those other supports that you may have in place to really focus on getting the survivor to the place that they need to be and building those really, really strong partnerships with the landlords from the beginning. So we're going to move on to look at what are the 3 stages of a survivor-centered partnership. And so when building a partnership, it's not only about the program model, it's not only about the landlord. And although we are in a survivor-centered mode as we're doing the work, we want to remember that this is definitely about building partnerships. And so part of looking at what that means is looking at our role and the rapport that we build and to have an effective partnership. Most people think that even for this role, the work can be easy, but in fact, the role can be proved to be really, really challenging. And maintaining what your role is and who is the best fit for this role is really important. So we'll take a look at that in the next few couple of slides. In addition to that, the rapport. Everyone has their own way of building rapport, and that's okay. But in this particular webinar, we'll look at some key things that we've done, that we've used, that have been really helpful in building and even maintaining those relationships and rapport with landlords. And relationships. Partnerships are relationships. And so most advocates will begin relationships with landlords, but can you maintain those relationships with all the different factors at play throughout the program? And so it's important to not only start strong, but to finish strong. And so we want to look at some of the things that will be necessary in order for that to happen. So again, the role. We want to look at who's in this role. How are we hiring for this role? How are we even supporting the person in this role? And so some of the key things that we want to look at is understanding your role while even in this role, because things can get a little unbalanced as you're trying to balance program agreements, leasing agreements, even, program interviews. For a lot of many different programs, there are very different things that can come up that can take you off. And so it's important to really understand your role from the get-go and acting as an advocate. Despite what your title may be, you're always an advocate for survivors. And what that looks like is really being acting as a liaison and being able to connect and communicate between the two of them from time to time, both openly and directly. It's important to have everyone on the same page. And so sometimes that means, yes, being the middle person in that particular role and being able to keep things moving and to keep things constant. That can really look like accompanying participants to viewings, to looking at different properties, to even negotiating the rents. Again, remembering that your role from the get-go is really for the survivor and to assist the survivor. And so negotiating those roles are really, really helpful. Negotiating rents in your role are really, really helpful. The most important thing in our role in working with survivors in general is to incorporate safety into your work. So thinking about incorporating safety into your education and outreach as you're looking and working with different landlords, incorporating safety as you're negotiating benefits in your landlord agreement or even in your memorandum of understanding. You want to make sure that that is incorporated into all of your work that you do. And so it's really, really important that safety is addressed as often as possible. And so when you're doing education, when you're doing outreach, either through different community work events or even through network, you want to ensure that safety is always paramount and that it's number one. And so that should be incorporated as you're talking in your paperwork and even in your documents and just in your language in general. And so that will help inform everything you do moving forward if you start out really, really strong with safety. Consistent communication with advocates and participants and landlords is really, really helpful. And so everyone being on the same space and the same page will prove to be and solidify those partnerships moving forward. Ultimately, this will enhance the advocate's ability to find and negotiate housing and support the survivor with being the leader of their own lives. And so remembering that although you're there to support the survivor, you're really there so the survivor can be the leader of their own lives, and the survivor will no longer need you at some point. But you want to be able to build something that's really strong, that's really healthy, and that's really positive. And so we're going to move on. So what that really looks like from the beginning is not only looking at what your role is, but who's really in that role and identifying the appropriate staff person, because not everyone is as friendly or as firm even to do this role. And so you want to identify someone who is assertive and knowledgeable of your program, boundaries, and even of your missions and philosophy of your organizations. And because this takes a lot of confidence. And sometimes landlords can be really standoffish, especially if they have bad past experiences with other programs. And so you want staff in this role who is comfortable expressing your program ideas and guidelines without feeling guilty or intimidated, regardless of your role. So being persistent is really going to be key. Not necessarily being pushy, but persistence is really going to be key in ensuring that you stay on point with being safe and having affordable housing and having something that works with the survivor and for the survivor. Staff should be able to demonstrate self-confidence when communicating, standing firm by your program mission, and treating everyone as equal partners. That's really going to be helpful. Remember, the key thing is to remember that everyone is a partner. So being familiar with the area and the local rents can be really, really helpful. Whether you are in an urban, suburban, or rural area, having someone who is familiar with the area can be a huge asset. Survivors I've worked with tend to be at ease once they learn more about the history or even the future plans of the area. Particularly here in like the district or even in our surrounding jurisdictions, sometimes there can be modernization plans that are going on. There can be historical landmarks, which can be prove to be really helpful in survivors feeling secure and confident in the decision-making process as they're selecting different units. Knowing the local supports, including daycares, transportation, um, family, churches, and employment can be really, really helpful to survivors as they're contemplating and considering what works for them. And so the other thing that you want to remember is that knowing and understanding the laws and knowing the local rents and comps, including the fair market rate rent, can be essential. And so the laws really, based on whether there are federal or local laws, can really help you to already begin to have those survivor-centered conversations at the beginning. And this allows you to not only negotiate, but to advocate confidently and effectively. Depending on what state you're in, will depend on which laws you are governed by. Of course, some things here that are really phenomenal. For instance, DC has some of the most comprehensive laws around breaking leases and changing locks. And I know some other states have that as well, but some jurisdictions don't. So it's important that you understand what are your boundaries, what are the laws, and even what are the protections for survivors, both on a federal level and then also on a local level. The other thing can be really helpful is really being comfortable conveying the survivor's preferences and safety needs. Remember, survivors' primary needs are really around affordability and safety. And so it's important that we use this opportunity to advocate and be comfortable advocating for those preferences. After all, again, safety is the number one concern and should be addressed to accommodate the survivor and their family. So, moving on. If you think about it, the second part of this three stages was the rapport. And so we're going to take a little bit, a little time to look at the rapport stage of building those relationships. So building rapport is really about thinking about how and what to do and what to say. And so really looking at the practical piece of what you're doing as you're building rapport. And so the definition of rapport is a relationship of trust between people, a feeling of sympathetic understanding, having a mutual understanding. And so if you think about it, this is where maybe a memorandum of understanding comes when we're thinking about mutual understanding, when we're thinking about trust, when we're thinking about a feeling of sympathetic understanding. This is where we want to start and begin to build the rapport. And so really looking at how you network, what you're doing, how you're saying having someone that's personable, that can engage with landlords at different landlord associating meetings, at different events that attract landlords, or even making connections with, seeing the for rent signs and being able to walk directly in to those landlord establishments can really be helpful as you're focusing on building that rapport. And so again, going back to what's safe, going back to being confident, and going back to being really firm and affirming your philosophy and your program's mission around getting survivor to a place where they can have their power and their choice. And so we want to provide as much choice as possible. And so what that means is that maybe even consulting with other housing providers. For some of you, I know there may have been other landlord trainings that may be similar, but this one, I really want you to get a sense of, what rapport looks like and feels like for you. Again, it goes back to really understanding what are your needs, but not only the needs of your program, but the needs of the survivor. And so identifying property managers or even a landlord as a partner is going to be very, very primary in this process. Being mindful of terms being used like, you're the landlord or you're the property manager, that's fine. But again, we want to start to look at our language and how we use our language. And so looking at our documents and how we use that language, ensuring that they're all survivor-centered and survivor-friendly, and ensuring that we identify the landlord as a partner first and not just as a landlord and as a property manager, because we want to go back to what are our roles and what are our responsibilities. And our role is to act as a partner, okay? And so you want to really be able to adopt a win-win philosophy to ensure that landlords feel like they have power in this process also, and that survivors understand their power in this process. And so by landlords and by survivors both winning, the program wins. We're winning as a community. And so we want to incorporate that into the partnerships as we're working with landlords. Being able to be personable and being reliable and even learn your partner. It's important to identify possible shared interests and common ground early early on as you're building relationships. And so understanding what are some of the past experiences that maybe the landlord has experienced, i.e. your partner, is really going to prove to be really critical as you're building trust moving forward. And so understanding what developing a mutual trust looks like can be really helpful. And so some people have identified a memorandum of understanding. What we've done is change the language to landlord partnership agreement because, again, it goes back to identifying landlords as partners and not only saying it, but doing it. And so working with hand in hand with the landlord to incorporate their feedback and using survivor-friendly language that really incorporates and builds that trust and rapport with the landlord. So again, going back to it's definitely not only about the landlord. It's definitely not only about the provider, but it's really about the survivor, who's the participant. And so helping them early on identifying the importance of the partnership is going to be really crucial. The outcome depends directly on their involvement. And so for a lot of our programs, particularly the programs who have funding mandates of providing voluntary services and trauma-informed care, they have the ability to decide how and how often they want to participate in a program. However, it's really crucial that survivors understand and can make informed decisions to help them realize the power and control they have. And so really identifying how they want to meet out in community or if they want to meet in their unit. I know for some programs they may be mandated by home visits and maybe even home inspections. And that's totally fine, but you really want to ensure that it works for the survivor. And if the survivor isn't a leader of how this is working, then you're doing it the total wrong way. And so the right way to do it is really, again, to help the survivor to be the leader of their own lives and to help them to realize the power and control. And so taking the power and control from that abusive relationship and placing it directly in the survivor's hands and helping them as they move forward and acting as a navigator. Identifying their preferences and priorities. Again, because this is based on survivor-centered approach, we want to always and as often address safety, referring to a priority checklist and even having safety as a number one priority can be really helpful. And so having conversations with survivors around what does safety look like for them. Because safety can look like a lot of different things based on your circumstances, based on your level of comfort, and based on your support. And so we don't want to get into a habit of identifying what safety may look like for us as a program or as a provider, but we want to help them to discover what safety looks like for them and being able to refer back to a priority checklist because a lot of different things can come up as you're exploring different opportunities, as you're exploring different units, even different communities. And so having those priority checklists can be really, really useful. Allowing the participant to be active in the process is going to be really, really helpful. And discussing the difference between preferences and priorities. We may all struggle with really trying to make sure that survivors are being active and then also voluntary services. But again, allowing the survivor to lead that process by encouraging survivors, empowering survivors, and being able to act as a support to survivors in arranging interviews with landlords and allowing the survivor to lead that process. Even in a housing search, there may be many areas you haven't considered because they wouldn't be of your preference as a provider or even as an individual. Let's be not all of us like the same thing, and not all of us have the same preferences, and not all of us have the same priorities. And so allowing the survivor to be active in the process and even identifying landlords that may be useful, identifying landlords that they may have already established relationships with can be really helpful in building the rapport with the participants. Because again, the participants are as much as a partner, and as much as they participate and as much as they're active is as much as the program and the results of the program and the results with the survivor will be successful. And it's really based on the survivor's level of comfort and the survivor, how they feel as a result of the program. So next we'll look at the relationship, because this is really going back to what I mentioned earlier on, which is that the partnership is the relationship. And so we want to really look at what it means not only to have those relationships, but also even maintaining those relationships. Because as things are happening and as things are coming up, the relationship piece is what will carry you throughout the course of your program. Um, Depending on your program may depend on the length of time that you may actually be working with the landlord. And so even those relationships with that landlord initially can provide really, really helpful as you're seeking out additional landlords and expanding your program. So to be successful, you want your partners, which is the survivor, which is the landlord, to feel comfortable in the working relationship. And so really thinking about not making assumptions. You want to really get to know and ask those hard questions. Some of the things you may assume around what the survivor needs are and what even the landlord needs are. Again, going back to some of the instances, some landlords may prefer that their checks are delivered in person, and for a lot of programs, they may not have the flexibility to do that. But just even if you do, maybe asking a question and figuring out a way that you can make that happen, right? And so making no assumption about what works best for the survivor or even work best for the landlord can really be helpful as you're moving forward. And so you want to ask the questions. You want to continue to build on the partnership and the relationship. And so really discussing your communication preferences. For some landlords, particularly the private landlords, they do have other employment, or they may be trying to juggle multiple properties or even units. And so being very, very clear and getting an understanding about how they prefer to communicate. Maybe emails are good for some, maybe telephone calls. For me, I know what's really was helpful was having those in-person, direct, up close and personal conversations with the landlords in a professional way. And so I had them on the spot. And so some of those difficult areas, which I had to massage, just even around some of the concerns of the survivors, or even addressing some of the concerns that maybe the landlord had with the survivors, and doing some education around DV 101. Those were the opportunities that I used to communicate with the landlords by doing those face-to-face visits and really even just going and just checking in with them. So understanding what your program mission is and understanding your boundaries is going to be really, really important, because you want to make sure that that's clear. And so for most people, the typical lease term is maybe 12 months, 1 year. But there are a lot of different lease terms that can come up, which can be 30 days or even 6 months that I've seen. However, you want to be clear of what your program can do based on the timing of even the lease agreement or even of the funding, and not to really overcommit yourself. And so it's important that even as a professional, even as a partner, you want to ensure that you're not overdoing things. And so be really, really intentional, and being really, really clear about your program mission is going to be really, really important. A lot of programs may even worry about exposing the survivor by discussing their program mission and even model and philosophy. But that's totally okay, because what we're doing is really advertising the program and not necessarily the survivor. And so, again, there's a lot of things that we can even talk about around confidentiality, but really what you're talking about is really talking about the program mission and not necessarily directing everything about the survivor. Of course, landlords can make assumptions and assume, okay, so this survivor must be working with this program because they've experienced violence at some point. But again, you allow those conversations and you allow that relationship and partnership to be built with the survivor and the landlord by creating those opportunities. But being really clear about what your boundaries are and releasing such information, or even breaking confidentiality around the circumstances of the survivor, of why they contacted your program, why they're working with your program, what are their needs in your programs. And so that's going to be something that you have to be mindful of as you move forward in working with landlords. As much as landlords are a resource to you, the program and the survivor are the biggest resource to the landlord. So no need to really go beyond um, your what you can do and what your program could do, and breaking some of those boundaries. And so please just be mindful as you're doing that. And so it really helps in doing so to really look at clarifying your expectations, mainly around what your roles are and what your responsibilities are. Again, as we talked about earlier, your role is to always advocate for the survivor. And so there are many things that we may not necessarily agree with as the person in this particular space or in this partnership. But again, understanding our role, understanding our task, understanding our boundaries and our responsibilities can be really, really important. So clarifying those expectations. What are we looking for? How much my organization can afford to provide? What's our funding provider? How long will we be funded? Understanding what on-call emergencies looks like, and not having access to your cell phone number or personal cell phone number for that matter, not giving those information out, nothing that you wouldn't normally give out. And so every program can have different boundaries or safeguards set up. And so even as you're contemplating um, building or even growing your programs and relationships with landlords, you want to be clear on what you can and what you cannot do, and knowing what your expectations are. For the most part, landlords want to know and want to expect the rent to be paid on time. So if you know that that's a really, really important expectation, it's going to be really, really important for you to, as much as possible, work with your finance department, work with your organization and executive leadership to ensure that you can meet those expectations. Let's be honest, there can be some bureaucracy, there can be some challenges, particularly for nonprofit organizations, around having funds or even cash available to even write checks. And so it's important that you're upfront and you communicate what the expectations of the landlord are, even to your organization heads. So having conversations with um, the program manager, the executive director, again, going back to even the finances, the finance director understanding, here's what we can do, here's what we can't, here's how this model works. Because sometimes, unfortunately, finance doesn't always get programs and programs doesn't get finances. And so clarifying and understanding those expectations internally in your programs can be really, really helpful, and and can definitely impact the relationships that you maintain with your landlord. And so you want to take time to reflect on what's working and what's not working. And so as much as possible, looking at, how can we improve? What are some of the things that we have done that we should consider maybe expanding on or even eliminating from our program? So doing those periodic check-ins with landlords just to say, hey, I'm just calling to see how things are working. Is there anything that we can do better? How can we support you can really help you in maintaining those relationships. Because I think what tends to happen, and this may be just me, but at the beginning things are, of any relationship, things are really nice and pleasant and happy, and then things can tend to like get busy and there's space and there's time. And so you want to be really intentional about how often and doing those check-ins that you do as often as possible, or at least have a schedule of doing check-ins and reflecting with your staff around what things need to be shifted or expanded on, and where are the supports needed. One of the things that I know that has been really phenomenal was taking time to celebrate our landlords partners. And so what we've done was using DVAM, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is October, to send gift baskets, wrapped in all purple. And so not only are we just wearing purple ribbons year round, but we're actually, promoting them as a partner and celebrating them and saying, hey, without you, this could be done. And as much as we don't want to believe that, hey, we can do without them, it's important that everyone is a part of this process. And again, reflecting on the landlord as a partner. And so even for a lot of programs, you may have annual awards ceremonies or have annual benefits. Those are really good times to celebrate your landlord's partners. And so even if those relationships aren't going the best at that moment, it's really going to be helpful to, offer those celebrations and offer those incentives to landlords as you move forward and maintain it, because you never know when you or even the survivor may need that landlord as a resource. And so those certifications that you can provide for the education and technical assistance can definitely encourage the relationships as you move forward in those relationships. And so not every program operates a scattered site housing or even housing first or even robbery housing. And some may provide non-residential counseling or work with landlords at project-based Section 8 sites or provide assistance to survivors seeking emergency transfers with landlords or even in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So I know VAWA does not pertain to every landlord. However, it's important that we understand for the programs and the landlords who are, what they may look like. And so all landlords are not covered under VAWA, and landlords that do not receive any federal funding under these categories under the Act are not required to comply with VAWA. And so under the Violence Against Women's Act, a landlord cannot refuse to rent to an applicant solely because the applicant is or has been a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, or sexual assault, or stalking. So that seems pretty clear. A lot of this ties back to some of the information that you may have learned in previous NASH seminars or webinars. And so landlords can also cannot evict a tenant who is a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking because of threats or violent acts committed against them. And so really looking at what the perpetrator is doing and not imposing those threats of eviction on the victim solely because of abuser tactics. Even if they took place on a property or even if they were inflicted by a household member or a guest, the VAWA really protects those tenants who are victims from being evicted. In addition to that, landlords cannot hold a tenant who is a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking to a higher standard than other tenants in any way. For some states and jurisdictions, there may be noise ordinance or, nuisance ordinance. And so you want to be very aware of what jurisdiction, what your laws are there, particularly here in D.C. The coalition has done a really great job of ensuring that there is no nuisance ordinance. And so determining what is your local law will be very important. But particularly with VAWA as it pertains to landlords for federally subsidized programs or properties, they can't hold the tenant responsible or to a higher standard because of any damage to the rental unit, and even when determining whether to evict or terminate the assistance. And so, again, VAWA only applies to the covered housing providers as identified in the Act. And so if you're not aware of what VAWA does, there are some VAWA trainings that may be coming up. And you also may want to check out safehousingpartnerships.org for more information, or we can also answer some questions at the end of the webinar. Okay, so as much as there are challenges for any relationship or any partnership, there can be some challenges when working with landlords. Unfortunately, there are a lot of, unfortunately, let me say that, unfortunately and fortunately, there are a lot of different providers trying to get the same landlords on their page to support their clients with providing residential units. And so sometimes it can be hard for landlords to manage those multiple programs at one time, maybe getting conflicting information about different challenges going on at the property with different tenants. And that can make it difficult to even manage the relationship because there's so many things happening at one time. And so although there are many incentives for landlords in getting subsidized programs to provide subsidies for tenants, there can be a lot of different programs in your area that are offering the same thing. And so we want to be mindful as we're working with landlords that these things can tend to come up. Also understanding there are many different communication styles, and just recognizing that you have to be really, really aware of what the communication styles. I think we talked a little bit about this, about like not assuming and understanding and having those conversations as often and as frequent as possible. Now, I know this tends to come up, and we have had a lot of different things that have happened here locally, but changes to funding, and that can really be based on even the changes to the administration. For a lot of our national partners and people out in the community, I know there was a fear attached to when there was a change in the federal administration. We weren't sure about what funding would look like. And so although there still may be some fear or even some lack of understanding or clarity about funding, that can prove to be a challenge even for landlords in really providing that safety net that we were talking about for landlords. Particularly if you have short-term funding and you're hoping to expand the program. And so recognizing those limitations of those grant dollars are really, really important. Also, really looking at, what are the stigma and what are the biases? And let's be honest, there can be some biases and stigma attached to survivors. And so those education and outreach opportunities can prove to be really, really helpful. But sometimes we have to put in a lot of work to ease the actual or perceived risk. And it's important that landlords really understand that, again, they are not social workers, and we're not asking them to be those social workers. And so not really focusing on the issues of the survivors, but really focusing on the issues of what domestic violence is and sexual assault and how they can support in this program. And so we, as advocates, as providers, as programs, we do not have the ability to manage people. We manage programs, we manage funding, but we cannot manage the survivor and we cannot manage the abuser. And so helping landlords to understand that domestic violence is a cycle, yes. Not only that, but understanding that we cannot dictate what survivors do and who survivor networks or family or the companies that they keep are is going to be really, really hard for some landlords to understand. But that's okay because it's a challenge and it's something that you can really work on as you move forward. And you can really use it as an educational opportunity around domestic violence. And so even though you can't manage people, you can still manage those relationships by really being really upfront and being honest about what that means and what that looks like. And so, again, going back to those boundaries and not necessarily being accessible to landlords 24 hours a day, but really being firm and assertive around what your availability is, what your contact information is, and how often or how they should contact you or how much you can tell them without, breaking confidentiality around survivors. And so sometimes that can be a little challenging for landlords to understand because, there can be an assumption around, if you have a tenant in my property as a provider, then you are responsible for what they do. And unfortunately, we cannot be responsible because we're assisting grown people who sometimes make grown people decisions, and that's okay. And I think it's important to really have those boundaries and understand and be comfortable with really outlining those boundaries, which can sometimes feel a little uncomfortable for landlords. Then you have some high barrier tenants who, you know, they come with large family sizes or they may be a credit risk, and there's really nothing that we can do about that but do our best to provide the level of advocacy that we provide for every other survivor that we work with. And so understanding what that looks like when those high barrier tenants, and what I mean by high barrier tenants is the people who may want access or have that you've been approved for your program, who may have credit barriers, who may have substance use, who may have mental health issues, who may have uh, social service workers in and out their units. And so it may look like they have heavy traffic and they may have a lot of stuff going on and they may have multiple sources of income, which may, bring some questions up for the landlords. Why is it that they've worked X number of places and, and so on. So there can be many level of things that come up. But again, they are challenges for the landlords, but there's nothing that you can do as an advocate or a provider to ensure that a survivor gets what they need. And so sometimes that means being really creative and innovative around your approaches in working with landlords. And so not every relationship will look the same way with every landlord. And so those past experiences with other programs, homeless services programs, or even those past experiences that really just left a bad taste in a landlord's mouth can be challenging for you as a provider as you're reaching out to landlords to really get them on board because unfortunately things do happen, things do come up. And so we want to be really transparent about what we can do and what we can do, but also understanding that just as you and the survivor have experiences, the landlords also have past experiences, and not all of them are the best experiences. And so that brings us to our takeaways. I just want to remind everyone just of some of the things that I really want you to take back with you. And that is, survivors are central and critical to this process. The landlord relationship, the relationship with the provider, none of that is even as important as the survivor. If the survivor isn't included as much in the conversations, in a dialogue, and in a documentation even, then you want to really look at what you're doing and if you're doing it in a survivor-centered and a survivor-focused way. And so also looking at private and corporate landlords can be really important. And just having a multiple or a, a good pool of landlords can be really helpful. With private landlords, there can be some good incentives because you have where you may have one direct contact, as opposed to corporate landlords where you have maybe a leasing agent, a leasing manager, then you have the corporate office. But I've had successes, honestly, with both, and so some of my biggest successes have actually been with some corporate landlords who not only were able to influence the community, but they were able to influence and impact their staff at different properties that they had. And so being a resource around providing training, providing connections, is going to be really, really helpful. Also, understanding that you do not want to overcommit, understanding your word is your bond, and making sure that you uphold the integrity of the program and of your organization is really important. Remember to get whatever is negotiated into the partnership agreement. Okay? You want to make sure that it's not just based on you and your role, but it's based on what your program and what your organization can agree to, and not to overcommit. And so educating landlords on best practices for responding to domestic violence is going to be important because they may be aware that you work with or that your program is a domestic violence or sexual assault organization, and even a homeless service providers. And again, understanding that there are some biases associated with that, and there is some stigma. And so educating those landlords as often as possible is going to be really, really helpful. And using those different awkward moments to really use them as educational opportunities. And so what that really means is really knowing the law. And so discrimination is never okay. So know your law, both local and federal laws, because although VAWA does not pertain to all landlords, it is important that you understand whether the properties that survivors are going to are federally subsidized programs, and so you can understand which properties are governed under these laws. Particularly, again, understanding what your local laws are. Some of you all may have different things that are happening on the ground. I'd love to hear about some of the different or unique local laws that you may have. Again, I know that some of the laws, the most known laws, which have really taken a progressive step, was around breaking leases, and even bifurcation. So just really knowing the law is going to be really important, and knowing what your legal resources are and connecting survivors to that. And last but not least, only with training, continuous education, and outreach can we strive to ensure that safety and the housing needs of survivors are met. And so getting these webinars, getting information, connecting with your national resources, such as NASH and the consortium, can be really, really helpful, so that you're caught up on some of the best practices, some of the things that other folks are doing, so that you can begin to ensure that survivors' needs are met where you are. I think that's it for my time. Are we ready for Q&A?
We are. Thanks, LaToya. This is Larissa. I'm back in. I want to just pull up the slide before we get to Q&A and just leave it here for you all with our upcoming trainings through NASH and also through the consortium. If you are on our network listserv, you should be receiving emails advertising these. If you want to join, you can sign up through our evaluation. Into the Q&A. I want to, LaToya, before I start with some of the questions, and they've been fabulous, I want to just reiterate this point. This is really important. There was some really active chat conversation about VAWA, addendums and whether that works for subleases or master leases, and a lot of really lively conversation. And so what I want to share with everyone who's having some ballot questions and who's covered, specifically which housing providers, what does this mean? I put my email in the chat box, so feel free to email me directly. If you want more TA around it, feel free to reach out to us. We'll put our contact information up in the last slide. And also, we will have a toolkit, some additional resources, and a webinar related to ballots, their housing, state local protections, all kinds of good stuff for non-legal advocates coming out in the next couple of months. So look out for that too. We know that there are a range of questions, so we're here to respond to them, but I want to shift into some of the really specific ones related to engaging landlords that were asked. So LaToya, let's start with the first one, which is, do you guys have any templates or resources to help with educating landlords?
Good question. So what we do have, and what you can probably find on Safe Housing Partnerships, are different toolkits, survivor toolkits, and advocate toolkits. Larissa, are those posted on Safe Housing Partnerships?
They are. They're posted in Safe Housing Partnerships. Yes.
Yes. In addition to that, HUDexchange.org or .com may also provide you with some different templates that you can use as you're doing outreach with landlords. One of the great things that we've done is created a housing preferences worksheet, which really helps the survivor to identify preferences versus priorities, or vice versa, priorities versus preferences. And so we've created those templates in addition to mutual expectation agreement, just because sometimes it can be really difficult working with various people under various conditions. And so drafting those landlord partnership agreements or even outreach letters to landlords is something that we have really strived to work for. So those are some of the things that we've created, and we may be able to share through the Safe Housing Partnership website.
Yes, LaToya, you read my mind. I wanted to make sure that we have those resources up on that website, and we will double check after this webinar. So everyone stay tuned. Definitely check out Safe Housing Partnerships, and we will make sure that those additional resources are there if they're not yet. So next question for you. So we have some technical questions, which I thought were really important because I know many of the folks on the call have them. So for sublease or master lease specific questions, where can I see a sample of a sublease? What are some examples of survivor-friendly language? How has the landlord partnership agreement been used? Is it something that is signed as an addendum to each lease or a document that each LL or PM signs once for all involvement for the program? So a couple of specific technical questions for you there, LaToya.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm not sure who asked the question, but I think you gave some good answers, in terms of creating an addendum or something. But I know for what we've done, we've been able to have a very informal conversation and not really formulate a lot of those documents. We, fortunately enough, have had really good partnerships with landlords in which they really created a new lease. And so although it was a sublease to someone who may have ended their current lease early, fortunately enough for us, because we have such a strong and really, really good with those landlords, we were just able to get a new person under the same lease conditions, and but extended to a year to the standard lease term. So they weren't actually going in as fulfilling the lease terms of the person who was exiting. We were, because of the good relationship that we had, we were allowed to fulfill the contract of having someone in that unit in a way of subleasing, but by creating a new lease. if that makes sense. And so I think, again, it goes back to what your relationships are with the landlords. And we can still look into maybe creating something like that. But I think even a signed addendum may be something that's really useful and helpful, and that you can really put into those landlord partnership agreements so that, again, being aware of what your expectations are from the beginning and being very forthcoming about, what the population that you serve experiences are, or even being proactive. You can maybe include language in your landlord partnership agreement around, if such should happen, then this is how we will respond.
Okay, so LaToya, this is helpful. So to be clear, I'm going to do some mind reading of the folks that asked this question just to dig a little deeper. So you're suggesting that sort of the survivor-friendly language, the relationship partnership language should be in the partnership agreement as opposed to, say, a sublease or a master lease, and also possibly including it as an addendum if that's an option. Is that right?
Yes. And so just to clarify, the partnership agreement is very different than the sublease and master lease. And so the partnership agreement is something between the landlord and the provider, and the lease agreement is only between the tenant, who's the survivor, and the landlord. And so in no way, no shape, no form do we want to be on a lease agreement unless we were the master lease of a property with a landlord. But other than that, again, the survivor is the lead, the survivor is in charge, and so the survivor has their lease with the landlord, and the only thing that the program should have with the landlord is the landlord partnership agreement, which are two separate things. And so although you can include addendums to the partnership agreement, even looking at what that may look like for the lease agreement will really be a discussion of what that looks like for the survivors. Larissa, did I answer the question?
Yes. You
Okay.
did, and actually you answered the following question, which was about the partnership agreement and whether that was the same as a sublease or a master lease. And so I think that clarification was really, really important. And for everyone who still has some technical questions and is like, how can I incorporate something if I want to, if the survivor is interested in that, and say the sublease looks like, you can reach out directly to LaToya. I just put her contact information here, or you can reach out through NASH, and we will provide that connection with LaToya so that she can answer your questions directly if there are some more technical questions that come up. So next question, LaToya. So where can I find examples of a priority checklist?
Yes, priority checklist. And so you can find examples, like I mentioned earlier, on the HUD Exchange website, which is hudexchange.com, HUDEXCHANGE.com. And they have some different resources and tools you can use there, as well as we may be adding some of those different templates and examples even to the Safe Housing Partnerships. So if they're not already on the Safe Housing Partnership, you can definitely look forward to those coming up soon.
Thanks, LaToya. All right, so next question is actually a clarifying question. Early in the webinar, you were talking about third party for payment as part of the financial incentive. And just a clarifying question, does that mean not going to the landlord directly for payment? Or is the landlord the third party you were actually talking about? Just a clarifying question there around what a third party for payment is.
Sure. And so I think particularly when we talk about third parties, we're really looking at the private landlord sector. And so for the private landlord sector, that can look a lot of different ways. And they may actually have a company name, or they may actually just have the unit or the residence listed under their sole personal name. And so there can be some different challenges there. And so when we talk about third party, we're really talking about the landlord, but addressing and who we address it to. So it may be addressed to somebody else who's a proprietor or in partnership, and really kind of figuring out what that looks like. Um, I know here we've even worked with apartment locators, and so although they were really resourceful and helped us identify units and different apartments, the check or at least the funds were supposed to go directly to the landlord. And so in that way, there's a lot of people involved in the process. And so just identifying like what situations work. And I think I really mentioned that because we've had so many different things that have came up. And so a lot of times it goes back to, well, who's considered the landlord, who's not? Are we talking about corporate? Are we talking about private? And so again, just to answer your question, this really pertains to the private landlords.
Okay, and just to be clear, for like any lease, and it does not matter, that it's really clear who it is that's getting payment that's part of the lease. So there's no sort of question or ambiguity there. Okay, fantastic. All right, next question for you. How do you create a landlord mitigation fund? Who pays for it? Landlords, the program?
This is a really, really good question because the landlord mitigation fund is fairly new, I guess, to the homeless community in general. I know here it was created through some local dollars that were awarded to a community-based program, and so that program coordinates the landlord mitigation funds, and landlords have access to those funds through that program. And so it's not created by the landlord, but it's created for the landlord as a protection in case there were any damages or things that were left behind, such as rent arrears or, something like that. And so it was created for the landlords, but not by the landlords. It's created by a program, typically through local dollars.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I want to just tack on here before we shift into the next question that there are, federal and some state and local housing protections that are connected to specifically ensuring that for survivors when a security deposit is involved, that if damages are as a result of domestic violence, that the survivor is not treated any differently than she would be as any other tenant, which means that that the responsibility for the damages should not be coming out of the security deposit. So I just want to be really clear here when we talk about a landlord mitigation fund, that does not mean that damages that are connected to domestic violence are necessarily pulled out of that. And so there's not a gray space there. It's a pretty clear line. So if there are additional questions around, oh, wait a minute, what does that mean? I worked with a survivor who ended up losing her entire security deposit because, she was assaulted in her apartment by her boyfriend. And, so if there are questions specific to that are coming to your mind, feel free to reach out again to me directly or through Nash, and we can help answer some of those. So I just didn't want there to be confusion. But otherwise, landlord mitigation funds are a really great way, as LaToya mentioned before, to really build that partnership with landlords who are concerned about damages to the unit. So next question, LaToya. What if the survivor has really awful credit or rental history?
You know what? We actually get this question a lot. And the crazy part is nothing is really too bad or too awful for a landlord to accept. And so it's really about finding that landlord that's the perfect fit for the survivor. And so that really sometimes the provider or advocate being really creative and taking a little more or a little bit of a different course or shift in order to build those relationships. And so not overcommitting, but also looking at what are some of the things that you need to do to ensure that the survivor is gaining just what you said that you would do, which is placing them into affordable and safe housing. And so, again, nothing is really too awful, but if it happens to be, when I think of awful, what I think you may be referring to is possibly, a lot of eviction history, little to no income, um,
Yes,
substance
that's
use.
right. Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, a lot of people come with a lot of different barriers. And so these are what these programs are, in fact, developed for. The survivors who do have all sorts of barriers, which can be really, really awful. Again, and it's really based on how we see awful. And so the goal is to really create a win-win situation. And so as bad as it looks, it may not be bad for that different landlord. And so just to make it a little bit more real for you, what we've done with some of the survivors who may, in your words, have awful histories, we've really focused our attention on maybe private landlords who don't necessarily have the extensive checks and balances system of corporate or management companies that they have to cycle through a credit check, a criminal history background check, and so forth. And so sometimes, being a little bit more forthcoming at the beginning and a little bit more intentional about who you have in your pool of landlords and reaching out or even creating new relationships with landlords who will be willing, but mostly within the private landlord sector.
Thanks, LaToya. So I hope that's a breather for everyone who's listening, which is the point LaToya is making is that landlords do have discretion. And so that's why these partnerships are so important because they also help survivors enter the door where the survivor may not initially have been able to do that. So thanks so much, LaToya, for that. One last question. We have 3 minutes left. So we're going to close out with this. What if we do not have dedicated staff to build these relationships? What do you recommend for structure in a program to still move ahead, even if we do not have specific staff for it?
You know what? It's really about being really truthful with what you can do and what you can't do, and really going back to what your mission is. And so having those strong organizational foundations and structures in place is going to be really, really helpful. I know when we originally got funding, we didn't even anticipate having funding to do these programs and to be doing outreach with landlords. And so, really being particular around like going back to what are your mission, what's your model, what's your philosophy, and standing firm on what that is, that should really, really help guide you regardless of what staff is in place. And so I think what you're also maybe hinting at is maybe the slide that talks about understanding your role and who you should probably hire even for that role. And so
Yes.
if in fact you have funding and you may not actually have the staff and you may not have the flexibility to hire new staff, you may have to just move forward with getting landlords and getting the survivors housed. It's important that you stay within the trauma-informed voluntary services, low barrier housing model to ensure that survivors, number one, have access to your program and to your services, and that you're doing your due diligence by incorporating the feedback and getting trainings and using the resources through NASH and the DV Consortium on how and some of the things that you can do to improve and even maintain some of those relationships. And so as long as you are understanding and knowledgeable of some of the things that you can do with what you have, that should help drive the relationship and build those partnerships.
Fantastic. And with that 1 minute left, we are going to thank LaToya so much for presenting, and I also want to thank NRCDV. They are hosting the webinar today as our partner, providing fabulous tech support, and I want to thank everyone who participated. Thank you all so much. Reach out to us. Stay on to do the evaluation, and or you will get the link with follow-up materials. And also, if you have technical assistance or training questions and needs, any of that good stuff, please reach out to us. There are multiple ways to seek support, and we are definitely available to help. And thank you all for doing such great work. Engaging landlords is one of the best ways to ensure that survivors have access to safe housing. So thank you all so much. Have a fabulous rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.